Hello, and thank you for joining this slideshow. I'm going to be covering two aspects, really: an urban development project run by the late Dr. Jember Teferra in Addis Ababa, and then something completely different, going down the Rift Valley towards the border with Kenya and looking at some wildlife. Although there's quite a lot of slides, I'm aiming to get through them in about 45 minutes. And at the end, I'm hoping you'll be amazed, not only at the extent of Christian work going on amongst the poor in Addis Ababa, but also the wonders of creation out in the rural areas. Well, just to set the scene, as you may know, Addis Ababa is set in a very rugged part of Africa. The capital city of Addis Ababa is situated at 10,000 feet, and the Rift Valley is some 5,000 feet above sea level. Those who've seen the previous two slideshows on Ethiopia will remember that the first slideshow was about a visit in 1994, and then in 2000 we was able to visit the Lalibella's rock churches. So this is the overall structure of what I'd like to cover. Going back to the origins of Glenfall Fellowship, which is how we came to form this relationship with Ethiopia. The lady on the left there, Liz Scotland, was at school with Jember Teferra, the Ethiopian lady in the middle. And the gentleman on the right is Revd Dr. Nigel Scotland. This relationship between Glenfall Fellowship and the Integrated Holistic Approach Urban Development Project goes back a long way to about 1989, and we've received regular updates from the project to keep us involved prayerfully and in terms of financial giving and visits. And this is one of our friends, Chris Hughes, who rode from Land's End to John O'Groats to raise some money for the project, one of many activities going on at that time. So the visit itself was between the 13th and 24th of August. This is a map of the city of Addis Ababa, and over on the right, there's the race course where you may remember I previously showed slides of the Epiphany celebrations. By 2004, the city was being transformed somewhat, as you can see, skyscrapers emerging. This was the headquarters of the African Union, like the United Nations for that continent. The bank, central bank for Ethiopia. And here's an example of the currency known as the birr. At that time, there were about 15 birr to the English pound. Some of the shops and the children are one of the most rewarding aspects of visiting the country. They're so full of joy and curiosity. It's a big novelty for them to see pictures of themselves in the camera like that. Margaret and I, along with our friend Ben Booth, stayed across the city from the racecourse in Jember's own home. And this was where her husband, Haile Georgis, had been Lord Mayor of Addis Ababa as well as Minister for Transport in the cabinet of Emperor Haile Selassie. Sadly, by this time, Haile Georgis had died. But this is the compound, a series of buildings with a little farm in the middle. And we were staying in one of these. Jember's has a real heart for the poor, but everybody needs some privacy. So this gentleman here was responsible for letting people in and out through the gate. Quite comfortable inside. We got chatting to a couple working in the slums of Johannesburg, who happened to be staying there at the time. And then Jember took us out on a tour around the city. This is a typical scene. Whenever the car stopped, as happened here, then immediately there would be people wanting money or support. And the way Jember dealt with that was by giving them food vouchers so that they could go to a shop and pick up what they needed there. By contrast, the Sheraton Hotel in Addis Ababa is quite westernised, very westernised. Jember took us there for afternoon tea. And elsewhere, you can see the architecture is gradually shifting away from the slums and into something much more modern. By this stage, the project that Jember had been working on, IHA-UDP, had started to hand over responsibility to different local organisations. This one's called Sabisto, Community-Based Integrated Sustainable Development Organisation. And here's a picture of a little shop in the shanty town around the centre of the project. The people were very grateful to get clean and reliable, safe drinking water. And Jember was working in those days with WaterAid for that to happen. She was also putting up new homes. Big improvement, I'm sure, from the corrugated iron that the people had been used to living in. And they're even planting gardens for them. And they were doing much of this work themselves. They just needed a little bit of support to get them going. There was also some major building work going on, again led by Jember, to put up condominiums, because the city authorities weren't very keen on spreading out across the ground, and they wanted to make better use of the land by building upwards. Some of the scaffolding here looks very unsafe by Western standards, but it seems to be holding up. And again, here's some of the building techniques which you don't see very often in Gloucestershire. That would be going back to the medieval times, I think. But again, it seems to do the job. Some of the people benefited from the job creation activities. And here are the characteristic Ethiopian baskets, which Tear Fund and Tradecraft and other organisations have brought over to us in recent years. Some handicraft and sewing work. These ladies had been rescued really from a life on the streets and given new skills to support themselves. Here we are sorting through some of the grain. And this is a blaze of colour, little shop at the side of the street there. Two little faces beaming out from lower down. Another aspect of Jember's work was caring for the elderly, and on our trip we were able to visit old people's midday meal. In fact, we're now all OAPs ourselves, Margaret and I. These older people don't have pensions, of course, like we do in the West, and rely on their families who are also struggling for support. So this initiative is a great help to them. Jember's work also encompasses caring for children. She was able to involve a Christian charity in Holland who built a whole new school for the kids and staffed it as well. So this is fantastic work, really. And the school and the library in one of the Kabelis, or villages as they're known, was very well equipped with books. Margaret and I had been sponsoring a child, Fantanesh, along with many others who were part of this child sponsorship scheme, but we were delighted to be able to meet our sponsorship child. And she's gone on since then to do great things, supporting herself and her family in various ways. And here's the minibus that our church, Glenfall Fellowship, helped to pay for. Well, I'll move on quickly now to the next part of the talk, and it's really Jember's initiative in bringing all the churches together in Addis Ababa, the main denominations anyway, in a project to help care for the urban poor. And this is a building that was her initiative, the Institute for Urban Workers. Something else is going up over on the right there. You can see people working on dodgy looking scaffolding. And the Institute for Urban Workers gives out various certificates for those who attend training courses and pass the exams. So here are some vehicles coming into the compound at the start of the conference. And so I just want to show a few slides about the conference, which was very challenging and at a very high standard. I say it was challenging just from the point of view of realizing the Christian responsibility to care for the poor, and something that we sometimes just pay lip service to, but when you actually know people like Jember who are working amongst the poor, it makes it much more motivational to keep involved. There's a welcoming committee. And inside the Institute, big lecture hall, some of the local dignitaries, Jember initiating the conference, welcoming people, then taking a seat alongside Lula Besha, that's literally a right-hand support person, various preliminaries of some amateur dramatics, a choir, and then Ray Backey, who's a clergyman from Chicago, also based in Seattle. And he's one of the most remarkable people I've ever met, but his knowledge of the culture in Ethiopia is quite amazing, and he had a real vision for Bible-based mission amongst the urban poor. We broke into various little groups, work groups. I think this one we were tackling the problem of prostitution. Not that I know anything much about that, but we had to report back in due course. A wonderful spread of food available. And this is the publicity agent for the work that Jember was doing, young lady. And we also got the opportunity to visit some of the other urban development projects. Jember's is one of the leading, but there are many others, including this one where girls who fall pregnant and would otherwise be thrown out of their home and living on the street are given a safe place to live in these old containers off ships. The guy who had this vision, I mean, it's remarkable. I think he was a Pentecostal guy, and what a difference it makes to these young girls and their kids. The Institute was still being finished off as we arrived for the conference, and then afterwards we stayed on, I think it was about a week of teaching on Christian urban development run by Ray Backey. We also visited the local Anglican church. Yes, even in Addis Ababa, the Anglican church has got a presence. This is St. Matthew's Church over near the British Embassy. And you could feel quite at home there. I think this was the Roman Catholic Church, Ethiopian Orthodox Church. I don't know who that gentleman is there reading the Bible and that statue, but there's so much to take in really in a short visit like this. And here's the Pentecostal church I mentioned briefly before. We just popped in there for a few minutes to say hello. Then a coffee ceremony. That's a big part of the Ethiopian culture, roasting the fresh beans. And there are 3 different types of concentrations of coffee that come out of all that, each with its own distinctive flavour, depending on how long it's brewed for. So somewhere in there is Margaret. Yeah, there we are in white towards the bottom of the steps. And these are all the people who are on the training course. Well, at last, we're going down the Rift Valley. Thank you for bearing with me through all that. The Rift Valley runs south from Addis Ababa for about 400 miles to the border with Kenya. And there's a series of lakes. I've shown it there in a kind of road map on the left. Well, it's another road map, I suppose, on the right, but it gives a bit more topography in colour. And we're heading down to a place called Arba Minch between Lake Abaya and Lake Chamo. Yes, well, Ethiopia hasn't got the safest roads in the world by any means, but there's an example of something that went wrong. One thing I did notice, though, was that the road was downhill for about 80 or 100 miles. And so you could set off on your bike, say, from Addis Ababa and just not pedal at all until you got into the Rift Valley, some 5,000 feet lower down. I thought, no, whether that's going to make it onto my bucket list, but it was a nice idea at the time. A view of life in the Rift Valley, as you'd expect, quite a lot of farming going on, sort of techniques that were around before the Industrial Revolution in England, herding the cattle. And I thought of back here in the Cotswolds, how the Greenway Lane, which some of you may know, running up from Sherdington into the Cotswolds, has been worn down by the hooves of animals over centuries, and the same thing's going on here, right alongside the relatively new main road, into one of the little bustling towns down the Rift Valley. Time for a brew. Although it's not a cup of tea that we would recognise. In fact, I think this is a coffee we're having. And at last, we're starting to see some wildlife here. Now, I'm not entirely sure what all these birds are. I think these might be vultures, but you'll have to forgive me if I make some mistakes. Yeah, these are definitely vultures. Well, it's actually the bearded vulture. It's a scavenger feeding mostly on dead animals, as I'm sure you know. It's the only known vertebrate whose diet consists almost exclusively of bones. And it has a wingspan of between 7 and 9 feet, often seen at refuse tips on the outskirts of small towns and villages. They pick up bones up to a quarter of their own body weight and carry them up into the air, and then they drop them onto rocks far below to break them into smaller pieces so they can get at the bone marrow. There are 2 rainy seasons in Ethiopia, in January and in August, and we were there in August, as I say, during the rainy season, but it did have the advantage that we were able to see some of the extraordinary bird life. So here we have an egret and a Goliath heron, I'm reliably informed. This spectacular bird, little blue bird, is known as the greater blue-eared glossy starling. Amazing. And I'm sure you recognise these as fish eagles, also known as the African sea eagle, with a distinctive white head and partially white tail with dark wings. And the wingspan of the male is up to 6'6", but the female is even more at 7'9". Feeding habits are opportunistic, eating fish as well as other water birds. So I'm not sure what this is. Margaret and I have tried to look it up, but there are a lot of bird species in Ethiopia, some 867 different bird species. So eventually we got down the road and we arrived at Lake Abaya. The time for a drink of premium lager beer, which is the best we could get. Well, here's one of the meals we had. This is soup, I think. Our driver over here on the right, Shetu, was a Muslim, and he struggled. He'd driven for 8 hours to get to that point. Some 350 miles of driving on relatively low-grade roads. This is the lodge we were staying in, by the way, overlooking the Rift Valley. It must have been about a 200-foot drop just beyond that external lighting you can see. Quite a comfortable lodge. And then the next day we set out going down into the Rift Valley itself. So we're heading off now into the, hope I can pronounce this right, Nechisar National Park and Lake Chamo. So we'd been staying at Arbor Minch, which is that little bit of, it's a town on that little bit of land between Lake Abaya and Lake Chamo. I don't know why the satellite picture shows Abaya looking relatively muddy, and Chamo looking like it's covered in algae. But anyway, and the Nechisar National Park is reached by going across that little spit of land between the two lakes. So I think Ashetu handed over to a different driver now, because we had to be escorted into the park with armed guard. There had been some trouble between the different tribes and also the government authorities. You can see quite a rugged track, but an amazing landscape. I think this must be a baboon. I've not looked it up. Shortly after seeing this, the armed guard spotted some people on a track similar to this, and he jumped out of the car, got his rifle, and he butted them with the rifle butt and encouraged them to leave the park because they weren't supposed to be there. However, there was another group of people who were coming out of the park who apparently had no trouble at all with their access. So we're not too sure what was going on. But as you'd expect with a game reserve, there were some animals. Here we have the zebras. This is Revd Zebra, also known as the Imperial Zebra. And it's the largest living wild horse. And it's the most threatened of the three species of zebras, the other two being the plain zebra and the mountain zebra. And it can survive for up to 5 days without water. Since the 1970s, the population has declined from 15,000 to about 3,000, but is now stable. And as you can see, the greavy is relatively tall, has large ears, and stripes are a bit narrower than some other zebras. Lives in semi-arid grasslands where it feeds on the grass. And here we came across some impala, medium-sized antelope up to 3 feet high, and then you can add another 18 inches to 3 feet because of their long antlers. They like to be close to water, eat grass, plants and fruits, and they feed and rest during the evenings and at night. These impala are plentiful and not at risk of extinction at the present time. Massive termite hills, and beyond you can see some huts, which you might not have expected to see there. Certainly it was a surprise to us. And we learned that there was a constant battle between the authorities trying to establish a park for tourism and the local tribes who'd been evicted from there, who kept returning. They had nowhere else to go. And we went inside the hut, had a look round and found some pots and pans that had been abandoned. And then a few weeks later, we realised that the authorities had burned down some of those huts in a final bid to clear the park. They were actually hauled up in front of the international authorities for, I wouldn't say a crime against humanity, but something like that was going on. So it was a conflict between the local people and the government that wanted to bring in big animals into that game reserve to attract tourists like ourselves. So it raises all sorts of ethical issues, really, which have been in the back of my mind ever since. Well, after visiting the Nechisar National Park, we then had some lunch and went to what's known as the Crocodile Market on Lake Chamo. The word crocodile market conjures up sort of leather goods, doesn't it? And, you know, handbags and shoes, but it wasn't quite like that at all. There was nothing for sale like that. It was more of a eco boat ride. This is just showing some of the people who live in that area who are outside the national park and can live in relative peace. Simple lifestyle, fishing and farming. Anyway, to get to our little boat, we had to walk out across the pier and then clamber into a boat probably about 15 or 20, maybe 20 feet long. And before we knew it, we were right up alongside Nile Crocodile. This was a bit scary, really, because they're big creatures. They're 14. The male is 14 feet long. They normally eat fish, mammals. I suppose that includes humans, really. Dead things floating around. Their feeding habits are aggressive and opportunistic. Well, we knew all that before we went, and we were just wondering how aggressive and opportunistic they were going to be. Anyway, I took some comfort from reading that they prefer to have their main meal after 5 o'clock at night. And we were mid-afternoon, so we should be all right. Hippos also popping up alongside the boat. Hippos normally eat grass. The males weigh up to 3 tons. They are known to be one of the most aggressive creatures on the planet. When they're out of the water, they can run at up to 35 miles an hour. So that was something to bear in mind. But they do spend most of the day in the water, standing on sandbanks. But ever so often, they would all bob underwater and come up next to the boat or just underneath it. And I started to imagine, what would it be like to be thrown into the water with all these hippos? Were they going to be friendly hippos or not? They can hold their breath for up to 7 minutes underwater. And when they open their jaws like that, they're not just yawning. It's a warning not to get any closer. Hippos apparently have a lifespan of up to 50 years. Slightly menacing expression there. Not that I'm an expert on hippos' expressions, but you know what I mean. I must say that these, the best of these wildlife slides were taken by our friend Ben Booth, who had a digital SLR. Now we're on to the great white pelicans, and there were thousands of these alongside the crocodiles and the hippos. They have a long pink and yellow bill and a large throat pouch used for catching prey and draining water from the scooped up contents before swallowing. The wingspan of the adult bird is between 6 foot and 11 foot. So it's a big bird, leaves its nest in the morning and may fly up to 60 miles in search of food. It is a highly sociable bird, vulnerable to crocodile attack whenever sitting in open water, and they have a lifespan of between 15 and 25 years. Well, we were glad to get back to our hotel safely after all that excitement, and here we're about to be tucking into a Nile perch, which is a big fish and quite tasty. The next day we set off for a place called Sodo, which is back up the road towards Addis Ababa. And there was an open market up in the hills. Yeah, a lot of activity going on. We were able to visit one of the traditional homes of the local people. Might be home to them, but it didn't feel very homely to me. They seem to be into gourds, which I think are plants that they scoop the contents out of and use for as bowls. And I did buy a hat from this gentleman. I've still got it. I should be wearing it now, really. It only comes out on special occasions. It's like a Jewish skull cap, if you know what I mean. Tier Fund were working amongst this community. We were quite impressed with what we saw. Next, as we head back towards Addis Ababa, we stopped at a place called Wondo Genet. And Wondo Genet is right next to a town called Shashemene. How about that? Shashemene. And you see Wondo Genet just next to it there with some lakes. And it's here that the Rastafarian community have their main base. They don't like to be invaded by tourists, so we just caught glimpses of them. But you may know that they regarded Emperor Haile Selassie as a god. And part of their worship is to smoke marijuana. I think it's going to be a while before that catches on in the C of E, though. We stayed at the Wabe Shebele Hotel, and we were in amongst various monkeys, which made life interesting. They're a little bit mischievous, these creatures. Our driver, Ashetu, who you saw earlier, was suffering from severe back pain, but there are some hot springs in the hotel grounds, and he was able to get some relief by standing under this spout of hot water and feeling the relief that came from that. We then go on to the next day to Lake Coca, which is well on the way back to Addis Ababa. And here, I think this is actually a volcanic crater that's become a lake. Here, Ben, who was mentioned earlier, who was with us from Cheltenham, took some very nice pictures of the plants and particularly the weaver birds. These are fantastic creatures, various species in Ethiopia, all brightly coloured, and they weave nests in close proximity to one another, starting off with a circle of vegetation and then building out from that. Really clever. And there's always a little doorway at the bottom, which they go up and feed their chicks. This is one that I got out of a book, but there we have a really good picture of an insect being exchanged from mother to chicks. Well, by this stage, we're almost back in Addis Ababa and see our friend, Dr. Jember Teferra, who'd invited us over in the first place and organised the conference. I think you'll recognise this place. We're flying back to Heathrow over Canary Wharf, over Tower Bridge. This is before the Shard went up. And so it only remains to give you a brief update on what's happened since then. Well, you may remember I showed the picture of the African Union building with all those steps going up. Well, this is the new African Union building as from 2012. And I think you'd agree it is very impressive. Meanwhile, in the slums, Jember was continuing to work prayerfully with Christian colleagues. This is a gentleman, I think, from Wayne Gordon over from America, who's supported the project in a very sustained way. Here's another view of the condominiums that were being built to take people out of the slums and into really good quality accommodation. Some of our friends from Glenfall Fellowship flew over to Addis, a whole group of them, and they made a very good promotional video, which I'd recommend if you get a chance to find it on YouTube. It's called Just One. And our friend, the late Keith Holland, had a vision for stocking the library in the Institute for Urban Workers, which was completely devoid of books while we were there. And he raised a lot of money and arranged for all the books to be shipped out there. They were exactly the sort of books on urban development which Jember and the teachers needed for the local people. Another one of our friends, Dr. Greg Valerio, had a passion for introducing Western teenagers to life in Ethiopia, and he set up a foundation which arranged that. And we don't know what effect this has had over the years, but I imagine many young people have been inspired since then to care for the urban poor. Another friend, Paul Wilson, continued his work of setting up a scheme to sponsor children for school purposes, particularly AIDS orphans. And there's even a part of this scheme which cares for the pensioners. So people can choose 2 or 3 of those possibilities. Jember tended to fly over to the UK every autumn, also on her way to Chicago and other places where she would be a lecturer in the autumn. Here she is among some of her friends, and we held a meeting for her on a regular basis. And she even came to one of our churches when I was a curate at Great Whitcomb. So here we have from the left David, her brother, and then Jember herself, and Lalo, her daughter, and there's Workner on the right with his wife. Sadly, she died. Yeah, I took a funeral service, and since then we've been doing what we can to help the family. We gave Jember a Lifetime Achievement Award on one of her visits. Chris Hughes has continued to be the treasurer for fundraising purposes, doing that within the scope of the Glenfall Fellowship, and more recently Cheltenham Network Church. The Institute, which was being opened at the time we visited in 2004, has changed its name to Birhan College and is coping well despite the challenges of the COVID pandemic. But they do need our prayers. 2 of our friends' children visited the project a few years ago. Lucy there was on her way down to serve in South Sudan, I think, and her brother, working for a big financial institution in the UK, but putting quite a lot of his efforts into charitable work as well. Sadly, Workner, one of Jember's sons, had a stroke, and that was about 4 years ago, and he's suffered disability ever since. This was one of his birthday treats. He's been in a care home for the past 4 years. Well, he was in hospital for 18 months and he's been in a care home ever since. A terrible loss because he was such a gifted person. And then sadly, Jember herself died of an undiagnosed heart condition on the 6th of January this year. And we managed to be able to see something of the funeral. You can see people wearing masks. This is in Addis Ababa. And one of her friends, Anne Rispin, who'd done an awful lot to bring education to Ethiopians in Addis Ababa and in Revd near Lake Tana, she gave a tribute, which we managed to turn into another little video. But Jember's life story was told in a very concise form in the Guardian obituary. And grateful to Mike Barrett for writing that up. So a quick update on what else has happened since then. Down the Rift Valley, the National Park has now got a proper entry and exit arrangement with guided tours and some more bigger animals than were there previously. The Crocodile Market, so-called, has continued with tours, but here we have the story of an Ethiopian pastor who was doing a baptism in Lake Chamo when something went dreadfully wrong. Sadly, he lost his life during that baptism. Must be a learning point there. The hotel we stayed at in Wondergennet has gone from sort of 1960s architecture to the space age with this new hotel and the hot pools that you saw. Remember those water spouts? It's now become a proper swimming pool. Looks like fun. So that concludes the tour of Addis Ababa and the urban development project, then down into the Rift Valley looking at the wildlife. I hope you've enjoyed it and see you again sometime.